The rain hammered against the windshield as Richard Thornton sat in his sleek black Mercedes parked across the street from a crumbling apartment building in one of the city's forgotten neighborhoods. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as he stared at the peeling paint and rusted fire escapes that seemed ready to collapse at any moment. This couldn't be right. His maid, Maria Rodriguez, the woman who had kept his penthouse spotless for the past 3 years, couldn't possibly live here. Richard had always prided himself on knowing exactly what was happening in his world. He knew stock prices before they hit the ticker. He knew which deals to make and which to walk away from. But sitting there in the downpour, he realized he knew absolutely nothing about the woman who arrived at his door every morning at 7 o'clock sharp, always with a warm smile and a cheerful, "Good morning, Mr. Thornton." He hadn't planned this visit. In fact, he'd been driving to his office when he'd spotted Maria's worn canvas bag sitting on his kitchen counter. She must have forgotten it during her lunch break. Inside, he'd found her wallet with an address scribbled on a piece of paper tucked behind her. Identification card. Any normal employer would have called. But something, perhaps the photograph he'd glimpsed of Maria with 2 young children, made him decide to deliver it personally. Now, as he climbed out of his car and crossed the rain-soaked street, Richard felt distinctly out of place in his $2,000 suit. The building's entrance door hung crooked on its hinges, and the intercom system was nothing more than a tangle of exposed wires. He checked the address again. Apartment 4B, 4th floor. The elevator was out of order, naturally. As he climbed the narrow stairwell, dodging puddles of water that leaked from somewhere above, Richard's mind wandered to all the times Maria had turned down his offers for a raise. "I'm grateful for what I have, Mr. Thornton," she'd always say. He'd thought she was simply being modest, perhaps proud. Now, seeing where she lived, those words took on an entirely different meaning. The 4th floor hallway was dimly lit, with only every 3rd light bulb working. Richard found apartment 4B and raised his hand to knock, but stopped when he heard voices inside. Children's voices. Laughter. He knocked gently, and the apartment fell silent. When the door opened, Richard barely recognized Maria. Without her work uniform, wearing faded jeans and an old sweater, she looked younger somehow. Despite the exhaustion etched around her eyes, her expression shifted from confusion to alarm as she recognized him. "Mr. Thornton!" "Is everything okay? Did I forget something important?" "You left your bag," he said, holding it up. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop it by." They both knew he was lying. Men like Richard Thornton were never in this neighborhood. Maria's face flushed as she took the bag, and for a moment, Richard thought she might close the door. Instead, a small voice called from inside. "Mama, who is it?" "Just a friend from work, mija," Maria called back. But Richard could see the shame in her eyes. She didn't want him here, seeing how she lived. What happened next would haunt Richard for the rest of his life. A small boy, no more than 7, appeared in the doorway, clutching a pair of crutches. His left leg was in a brace, and Richard noticed the way he struggled to balance his small frame. "You're the man from Mama's picture," the boy said, grinning. "She says you're very important." Richard's throat tightened. "What's your name, son?" "Diego, and that's my sister." "Carmen." He pointed to a little girl of about 5, peeking from behind a tattered couch. "Please, Mr. Thornton, you don't have to," Maria began. But Richard wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had adjusted to the dim apartment, and he was taking in details he wished he could unsee. The furniture was mismatched and worn. The walls were water-stained. In the tiny kitchen, he could see a pot of rice on the stove and nothing else. The apartment was clean, spotlessly clean, but it couldn't hide the poverty that clung to every corner. Then he saw it. On a makeshift table constructed from an old door and cinder blocks, there was a collection of items that made his heart stop. His items. A coffee mug he'd thrown away months ago because it had a small chip. A blanket he'd replaced with a newer one. Books he'd donated to his building's lobby. Even a picture frame he'd discarded. Now holding a crayon drawing of a house with a family standing in front. "You take my trash," he said softly. The realization hitting him like a physical blow. Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thornton. I never took anything valuable, I swear. Just things you were throwing away. The children, they need so much. And Diego's medical bills." Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. "How long has your son needed those crutches?" 2 years. He was born with a problem in his hip. The doctors say surgery could fix it, but our insurance—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Richard looked at little Diego, still smiling despite the obvious pain he must live with every day. He looked at Carmen, wearing a dress that had been patched. So many times it was hard to tell what the original fabric had been. He looked at Maria, this woman who came to his home every single day and cleaned and cooked and smiled, never once complaining, never once asking for more than what she'd earned. "Why didn't you tell me?" The words came out harsher than he'd intended. Maria lifted her chin, and despite her tears, her voice was steady. "Because, Mr. Thornton, my problems are not your problems. You pay me fairly for my work. That's all you owe me. The rest, that's my responsibility." In that moment, Richard Thornton, who had built a fortune on reading people and situations, felt like the most ignorant man alive. He'd been measuring success in stock, portfolios, and real estate holdings, while the woman who took care of his home couldn't afford to take care of her own child. "I need to go," he said abruptly, and saw the fear flash across Maria's face. She thought she was fired. She thought she'd finally pushed her luck too far by letting him see behind the curtain of her carefully maintained dignity. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse, surrounded by luxury, thinking about that apartment, about a little boy who smiled despite his pain, about a mother who salvaged treasure from his trash, about the invisible people who moved through his life, making it comfortable while he remained oblivious to theirs. The next morning, Maria arrived at 7 o'clock sharp as always, but Richard was already awake, waiting. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and he could tell she'd been crying. "Mr. Thornton, about yesterday," she began, but he held up his hand. "I've made some calls," he said. "Diego has an appointment at St. Mary's Hospital next week with the best orthopedic surgeon in the state. Everything is covered." Maria's bag slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud. I can't accept that. That's too much. I can't—" "You're right," Richard interrupted. "It is too much, and I should have offered help a long time ago. But there's more. I've also arranged for you and your children to move into one of the apartments I own in a better part of town. The rent will be adjusted to what you're paying now." "Mr. Thornton, please—" "Maria, stop." He moved closer, and for the first time in 3 years, he really looked at her, not as his maid, but as a person, as a mother fighting impossible odds, as someone who had shown him more grace than he'd ever shown her. "You've spent 3 years taking care of my home. Let me do this one thing for your family. Please." The tears came then, and Maria sank into a chair, her shoulders shaking. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Richard thought about all the answers he could give. Because it was the right thing to do. Because he could afford it. Because he'd been blind and selfish. But what he said was simply, "Because yesterday, a little boy with crutches called me important, and I realized I've spent my whole life accumulating things that don't matter, while you've been rich in the only way that counts. You taught me that, Maria, you and your children." 6 months later, Richard stood in the stands of a community soccer field, watching Diego run, actually run, chasing after a ball with a pack of other children. The surgery had been a success. Maria stood beside him, and Carmen clung to his hand, chattering about her new school. Richard's business associates thought he'd gone crazy when he started the foundation. "Helping the help," one of them had called it with a dismissive laugh. Richard had removed him from his contact list immediately. The foundation provided medical care, housing assistance, and educational opportunities for domestic workers and their families. Maria was its first success story. There would be many more. "Thank you," Maria said softly, her eyes never leaving her son. "You gave us everything." Richard shook his head, watching Diego score a goal and throw his arms up in victory. "No, Maria, you gave me everything. You gave me back my humanity. I just didn't know I'd lost it until I showed up at your door that rainy night. As the sun set over the field and the children's laughter filled the air, Richard understood something profound. True wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts or penthouse views. It was measured in moments like these, in lives changed, in the smile of a boy who could finally run. He'd spent 53 years of his life climbing the ladder of success, only to discover that he'd been climbing in the wrong direction all along.